Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're going to delve into a case that shocked the Long Island community in 2009, the tragic murder of Rebecca Coster. This is a story about a vibrant young woman whose life was cut short by an encounter with pure evil, and the painstaking investigation that brought her killer to justice. So, let me tell you about a December night that changed everything for one family forever. Rebecca Coster, or Becky, as everyone called her, was 24 years old in December of 2009. She lived in Medford, Long Island, with her mother Barbara and stepfather Larry Ross. Becky was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Her friends described her as having a bubbly personality, infectious laughter, and an unmistakable zest for life that drew people to her like a magnet. During the day, Becky worked as a home health care aide, a job that perfectly suited her caring nature. She spent her time looking after elderly patients and individuals with autism, providing them with the compassion and attention they needed. It was demanding work, both physically and emotionally, but Becky found deep satisfaction in helping others. Her co-workers often remarked on her patience and genuine kindness, qualities that made her exceptional at her job. But Becky wasn't all work and no play. When the sun went down and her shift ended, she transformed into someone who lived for the moment. She loved going out with friends, dancing, laughing, and simply enjoying the vibrant nightlife that Long Island had to offer. For Becky, these nights out weren't just about having fun, they were about feeling truly alive. There was something almost electric about her energy when she was out socializing, as if she could absorb all the life and excitement around her and radiate it back tenfold. Her relationship with her mother Barbara was particularly close. Barbara, who worked as a nurse, understood the demands of caring for others, and she admired her daughter's dedication to her work. But like any loving mother, Barbara worried about Becky when she went out at night. It had become their routine. Becky would text her mother when she got home safely, and Barbara would sleep better knowing her daughter was secure in their house in Medford. In late 2009, Becky had been dating a man named Dan Mayer for a few months. Dan was 28, older than Becky, but they seemed to enjoy each other's company. Their relationship was still relatively new, and Becky's family was still getting to know him. He seemed nice enough, though they hadn't had much time to form strong opinions about him one way or another. December 3, 2009, was a Thursday. For most people, it was just another weeknight, perhaps a time to stay home and prepare for the approaching weekend. But for Becky, it was an opportunity to go out and enjoy herself with Dan and some friends. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary Thursday night would be her last. The evening of December 3rd started like many others for Becky. She got ready to go out, probably taking her time with her hair and makeup, choosing an outfit that made her feel confident and beautiful. She was planning to hit a couple of bars in Suffolk County with Dan and their group of friends, nothing unusual or particularly exciting, just a typical night out for a group of young people looking to unwind after work. The group decided to visit two different establishments that night. Their first stop was unremarkable, just drinks, conversation, and the kind of casual socializing that fills most bar scenes across America every night. But their second destination would prove to be fateful in ways none of them could have imagined. Around 3:20 in the morning, they arrived at Butcher Boy's Bar and Grill in Holbrook. By this time of night, the energy in most bars takes on a different quality. The earlier evening crowd has usually gone home, leaving behind the die-hard night owls, the shift workers grabbing a drink after work, and those who simply don't want the night to end. The lighting seems dimmer, conversations become more intimate or sometimes more desperate, and there's often an undercurrent of possibility, both exciting and dangerous, that comes with the late hours. Becky and her group didn't stay at Butcher Boy's very long. They had been out for hours already, and the night was beginning to wind down. But during their brief time there, something happened that would set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. At some point during their visit, while Becky was at the bar ordering a drink, a man approached her. He was in his 30s, unremarkable in appearance, just another face in the late-night crowd. But something about Becky caught his attention. Maybe it was her vibrant energy, her beauty, or simply the fact that she seemed approachable and friendly. Whatever it was, he decided to strike up a conversation. The surveillance cameras at Butcher Boy's captured this interaction, though at the time, no one knew how crucial this footage would become. The cameras showed Becky talking to this stranger, their conversation appearing casual and innocent. But then something interesting happened. The man took Becky's phone from her and began using it. To anyone watching, it would have looked like he was entering his phone number, giving her his contact information for a possible future meetup. This exchange lasted only a few minutes, and then Becky rejoined her friends. By 3:20 a.m., she was ready to leave. The surveillance footage shows her standing by the jukebox, clearly indicating to Dan and the others that she wanted to go home. She had work the next day, and like most responsible adults, she knew when it was time to call it a night. The group left Butcher Boys together, and Dan drove Becky home to Medford, arriving at her house around 3:30 a.m. Everything seemed normal. Becky got out of the car, said goodnight to Dan and their friends, and walked into the house she shared with her mother and stepfather. Dan drove away, probably thinking about his own bed and the sleep he needed before starting another day. True to her routine, Becky sent her mother a text message to let her know she was home safely. Barbara, who was working a night shift at the hospital, received the message and felt that familiar sense of relief that comes when a parent knows their child is safe. Everything was as it should be. Or so it seemed. The next morning, Friday, December 4th, Barbara Ross finished her night shift and drove home to Medford. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed Becky's car parked in its usual spot. Inside the house, she could see Becky's belongings, her purse, her keys, the normal detritus of a night out. Everything suggested that Becky had come home and settled in for the night, just as she had indicated in her text message. But when Barbara went to check on her daughter, perhaps to see if she was awake and ready for breakfast, she found Becky's bedroom empty. The bed didn't look like it had been slept in. More troubling still, Becky's phone was nowhere to be found in the house, even though all her other belongings were there. At first, Barbara might have thought there was a simple explanation. Maybe Becky had gone for an early morning run, or perhaps she had stepped out to grab coffee or breakfast. But as the morning wore on and Becky failed to appear, a cold knot of worry began forming in Barbara's stomach. When Becky didn't show up for work that day, Barbara's concern transformed into genuine alarm. Becky was responsible about her job. She cared about her patients and took her duties seriously. For her to simply not show up without calling in was completely out of character. Barbara immediately called Dan, hoping he might have some insight into where Becky could be. But Dan was as puzzled as she was. He confirmed that he had dropped Becky at home around 3:30 a.m., just as she had texted. He had seen her walk into the house. As far as he knew, that was the last time anyone had seen her. With growing dread, Barbara contacted the police to report Becky missing. In cases like this, police often initially assume that the missing person will turn up on their own. Perhaps they went to stay with a friend without telling anyone, or maybe they needed some space and would return when they were ready. But Barbara knew her daughter. This wasn't like Becky at all. The family and friends immediately mobilized. They printed flyers with Becky's picture and description, blanketing the neighborhood and surrounding areas. They went door to door, asking neighbors if they had seen anything unusual the night before or early that morning. They checked with all of Becky's friends, co-workers, and acquaintances, hoping someone might have some information about where she could be. The hours turned into a day, and the day began stretching toward a second day. With each passing hour, the family's hope began to mix with an increasingly desperate fear. Barbara found herself staring at her phone constantly, willing it to ring with news that Becky had been found safe. Meanwhile, the police began their own investigation. They obtained the surveillance footage from both bars that Becky had visited the night she disappeared. When they reviewed the footage from Butcher Boys, they immediately noticed the interaction between Becky and the unknown man at the bar. Here was someone who had clearly made contact with Becky on the night she disappeared, someone who had taken her phone and presumably given her his contact information. But before they could fully pursue this lead, something happened that would both give the family hope and add a sinister new dimension to the case. 3 days after Becky disappeared, on Sunday, December 6th, Barbara's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. When she looked at the screen, her heart leaped. The message was coming from Becky's phone number. The text was brief but confusing. Becky was with Dan, but she didn't know where she was. Barbara's mind raced as she tried to process this information. If Becky was with Dan, why hadn't Dan said anything when she had spoken to him? Why would Becky not know where she was? The message raised more questions than it answered, but at least it suggested that Becky was alive. Barbara immediately called the police and contacted other family members and friends. Soon, a group of worried loved ones had gathered at Dan's house, hoping to find Becky there. When they arrived, police were already on the scene, but a search of Dan's home revealed nothing. Becky wasn't there, and Dan seemed as confused and concerned as everyone else. Then Barbara's phone buzzed again. Another text from Becky's number, but this one was even more disturbing. Dan had tied her up in a basement. This message sent everyone into a frenzy. If this was true, then Dan had been lying to them all along. But when police searched every inch of Dan's property, including areas that could be considered basements or cellars, they found no trace of Becky. Moreover, Dan's behavior and demeanor didn't match that of someone who was holding a person captive. He seemed genuinely bewildered and concerned about Becky's welfare. The police made a crucial decision. They would trace the location of Becky's phone using cell tower pings to try to determine where these messages were actually coming from. The technology wasn't as sophisticated in 2009 as it is today, but it was still possible to get a general area where a phone was being used. The results of the phone trace were puzzling and ominous. The messages weren't coming from Dan's house or anywhere near it. Instead, the phone signals were pinging from an industrial area in Comac, about 20 miles from Becky's home in Medford. This was an area of warehouses, small businesses, and light industry, not a residential neighborhood where someone might be hiding a kidnapping victim. For Becky's family and friends, these text messages were a cruel form of psychological torture. On one hand, they suggested that Becky was still alive, which gave them hope to cling to. On the other hand, the messages implied that she was being held against her will, possibly by someone she trusted. The second message, in particular, with its accusation against Dan, created suspicion and division among the very people who should have been working together to find Becky. What the family didn't know at the time was that these messages were part of a calculated campaign of deception. Someone was deliberately using Becky's phone to mislead the investigation and cause maximum emotional pain to the people who loved her. Someone who was not only capable of harming Becky but who also took pleasure in the suffering of others. As the family grappled with these confusing and terrifying messages, police were working around the clock to trace every lead. They were particularly interested in the man from the surveillance footage at Butcher Boys, the stranger who had taken Becky's phone and entered his contact information. But before they could identify this person, the case would take its most devastating turn. On December 4th, just one day after Becky disappeared, a motorist driving through a rural area of North Stonington, Connecticut, noticed something troubling near the intersection of Jeremy Hill Road and Route 201. It was around 7:20 in the evening, and the winter darkness was already settling over the Connecticut countryside. What the motorist saw was the remnants of what appeared to be a fire in a field beside the road. But this wasn't the aftermath of a brush fire or someone burning yard waste. There were shapes in the ashes, forms that didn't belong in an ordinary fire. The motorist called police. When investigators arrived at the scene, they discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The fire had consumed most of what had been burned there, but enough remained to tell a horrific story. These were human remains, but they had been subjected to such brutal mutilation and dismemberment that immediate identification was impossible. The body had been wrapped in a blanket and plastic bags before being set on fire. The head had been placed in a separate plastic bag. But even more disturbing than the burning was what had been done to the victim before the fire was set. Every fingertip had been cut off. Every toe had been removed. The victim's face had been carved away, along with the nose and ears. Hair had been cut off, and even a tattoo had been surgically removed from the back. This wasn't just murder, this was a systematic attempt to make identification impossible. The remains were so badly damaged that it took several days for the medical examiner to make a positive identification. During those days, Becky's family continued to receive the taunting text messages, continuing to believe that their daughter might still be alive somewhere. The identification finally came through dental records. The remains found in that Connecticut field belonged to Rebecca Coster. The cause of death was determined to be a stab wound to the liver, a wound that would have been fatal. But the killer hadn't stopped there. The mutilation had been carried out after death, in a coldly calculated attempt to prevent exactly what had ultimately happened, identification of the victim. When Barbara and the rest of Becky's family learned the truth, their world collapsed. Not only was their beloved Becky dead, but she had died in a manner so brutal and dehumanizing that it defied comprehension. The text messages they had received, which had given them hope that she was still alive, had been sent by her killer, a final, sadistic twist in an already incomprehensible crime. The location where Becky's remains were found, North Stonington, Connecticut, about 85 miles from her home in Medford, raised new questions for investigators. Why had the killer transported her body so far from Long Island? What was the connection to Connecticut? And most importantly, who was capable of such calculated brutality? The answer to these questions lay in the surveillance footage from Butcher Boy's Bar and Grill, and in the phone calls that had been made to Becky's phone in the early hours of December 4th. With Becky's remains identified and the cause of death established, police could now focus their investigation with a clearer picture of what had happened. They knew that Becky had been murdered, probably within hours of returning home from her night out. They knew that her killer had gone to extraordinary lengths to prevent identification of her body. And they knew that someone had been using her phone to send misleading text messages to her family. The investigation team carefully reviewed all the evidence they had gathered. The surveillance footage from Butcher Boys showed the unknown man taking Becky's phone and apparently entering his contact information. Phone records revealed that Becky had received 2 phone calls about an hour after Dan had dropped her off at home. These calls had come from the same number that had been entered into her phone at the bar. The phone number belonged to a 30-year-old man named Evans Ganthier. For Becky's family, this name meant nothing, they had never heard of him before. As police would soon discover, Becky hadn't known him either, beyond their brief encounter at the bar that night. Evans Ganthier lived in Port Jefferson Station on Long Island. When police began investigating his background, they found a man with no significant criminal history, someone who would not have stood out in a crowd or raised immediate suspicions. But when they interviewed him about his contact with Becky, his story began to raise red flags. Initially, Evans denied any significant involvement with Becky's disappearance. He admitted to meeting her at the bar and getting her phone number, and he acknowledged calling her later that night. But he claimed that was the extent of their interaction. However, police had more than just Evans's word to go on. They obtained search warrants for his home and vehicle, and what they found there painted a very different picture of what had happened on the night of December 3rd. In Evans's SUV, investigators found traces of blood. Moreover, there was evidence that his garage had been recently and thoroughly cleaned, the kind of cleaning that goes far beyond normal maintenance. Someone had been very concerned about eliminating any trace evidence from that space. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Despite the killer's meticulous efforts to destroy all means of identifying Becky's remains, one small piece of evidence had survived. On a piece of duct tape that had been wrapped around parts of Becky's body, investigators found a fingerprint. When they ran this print through their database, they got a match: Evans Ganthier. Confronted with this physical evidence, Evans finally began to tell a different story. But even his revised version of events seemed designed to minimize his culpability and paint the death as something other than deliberate murder. According to Evans's new account, he had indeed called Becky after Dan dropped her off at home. He claimed that she had agreed to meet him, and he had picked her up from her house and brought her back to his home in Port Jefferson Station. But then, according to Evans, something had gone terribly wrong. Evans claimed that while they were in his garage, Becky had suddenly begun coughing and foaming at the mouth. In this distressed state, he said, she had fallen over some dumbbells in his garage and struck her head. According to his story, this accident had killed her. But even if this story were true, and investigators had serious doubts about it, it couldn't explain what happened next. Evans admitted that he had panicked upon finding Becky dead. But instead of calling for help or reporting the death to authorities, he had made a series of decisions that revealed a cold and calculating mind. Evans confessed to mutilating Becky's body in an attempt to prevent identification. He had systematically removed her fingertips, toes, face, hair, and even a distinctive tattoo from her back. He had then wrapped her dismembered remains in blankets and plastic bags, loaded them into his SUV, and driven to Port Jefferson, where he boarded a car-carrying ferry to Connecticut. Surveillance footage from the ferry confirmed this part of his story. The cameras showed Evans's SUV boarding the ferry, with Evans appearing calm and unremarkable. No one watching the footage would have suspected that the trunk of his vehicle contained the mutilated remains of a murder victim. Once in Connecticut, Evans had driven to the remote location near North Stonington where he disposed of Becky's remains and set them on fire. He then returned to Long Island, presumably thinking he had committed the perfect crime. But Evans hadn't stopped there. Using Becky's phone, he had sent the text messages to her mother, messages designed to misdirect the investigation and prolong the family's agony. The message accusing Dan of tying Becky up in a basement was particularly cruel, as it was designed to throw suspicion on an innocent man while giving false hope that Becky might still be alive. Evans Ganthier was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the death of Rebecca Coster. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors faced the challenge of proving that Becky's death was not the accident that Evans claimed it to be. The prosecution's case rested on several key points. First, the sheer brutality and calculation involved in the mutilation of Becky's body suggested a mind capable of premeditated murder, not someone who had panicked after an accidental death. The systematic removal of identifying features, fingertips, face, tattoo, required a level of cold-blooded planning that seemed inconsistent with someone who was simply trying to cover up an accident. Second, the prosecution pointed to the fact that Becky had been stabbed to death, specifically with a fatal wound to her liver. This was not consistent with falling and hitting her head on dumbbells, as Evans had claimed. The medical evidence clearly showed that Becky had been murdered, not accidentally killed. Third, there were the text messages sent from Becky's phone after her death. These messages showed a level of psychological cruelty and manipulation that went far beyond what might be expected from someone who was simply trying to cover up an accidental death. The messages were designed to cause maximum pain to Becky's family while misdirecting the police investigation. Evans's defense team maintained his innocence and continued to argue that Becky's death had been accidental. They suggested that Evans had panicked and made poor decisions, but that he was not a murderer. However, the jury found the prosecution's case compelling. After deliberating on the evidence, the physical proof, the medical examiner's findings, the calculated nature of the cover-up, and Evans's own contradictory statements, they reached a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The judge in the case, Justice Richard Ambrose, was particularly direct in his assessment of Evans's claims. At sentencing, he told Evans that his story of accidental death makes no sense. "Neither I nor the jury believes you." Evans Ganthier was sentenced to the maximum penalty for second-degree murder, 25 years to life in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2035, when he will be in his 50s. The conviction of Evans Ganthier brought a measure of justice for Rebecca Coster's family, but it could never truly heal the wound left by her brutal murder. Barbara Ross lost not just her daughter, but her faith in the basic safety and predictability of the world. The text messages she had received from Becky's phone, messages that had given her hope while her daughter was already dead, represented a level of cruelty that most people cannot imagine. The case raised disturbing questions about the randomness of violence and the dangers that can lurk in seemingly innocent social interactions. Becky had done nothing wrong on the night she died. She had gone out with friends, been responsible about getting home safely, and followed all the normal precautions that young women are taught to take. Her only mistake was being kind to a stranger who approached her at a bar, a basic human interaction that millions of people have every day without consequence. The brutality of the crime also highlighted the lengths to which some killers will go to avoid responsibility for their actions. Evans Ganthier's mutilation of Becky's body showed a level of calculation and coldness that suggested this was not his first experience with violence, even if it was his first murder. The systematic removal of identifying features required not just a willingness to commit violence, but a detailed understanding of how such violence could be used to thwart a police investigation. For the law enforcement officers who worked on the case, the investigation represented both a success and a source of lasting trauma. They had successfully identified and convicted Becky's killer, bringing justice for her family. But the images and evidence they had processed in the course of their investigation, the mutilated remains, the crime scene photos, the cold calculation behind the killer's actions, would stay with them for the rest of their careers. The case also served as a reminder of the importance of surveillance technology and modern investigative techniques. The surveillance footage from Butcher Boy's bar provided the crucial link between Becky and her killer. Cell phone tracking helped locate the general area where the misleading text messages were being sent. And fingerprint analysis provided the physical evidence that ultimately sealed Evans's fate. But perhaps most importantly, the case highlighted the need for continued vigilance in protecting women from predatory violence. Evans Ganthier had targeted Becky precisely because she appeared to be alone and vulnerable at the bar that night. His willingness to approach her, get her contact information, and then call her after she got home safely suggested a predatory mindset that was focused on finding and exploiting opportunities for violence. As we reflect on this case, it's worth considering what we can learn about Evans Ganthier and others like him. On the surface, Evans appeared to be an ordinary man, someone who could blend into any crowd, who didn't attract attention or suspicion. This is often the most frightening aspect of predatory criminals, their ability to appear normal and harmless while harboring violent intentions. The fact that Evans was able to approach Becky at the bar and engage her in what appeared to be normal social conversation suggests a level of social skill and manipulation. He didn't present as obviously dangerous or threatening. If he had, Becky would never have given him her phone number or agreed to meet him later. This raises uncomfortable questions about how we assess danger in social situations. Most of us rely on our instincts and our ability to read social cues to determine whether someone seems safe or threatening. But Evans was apparently able to mask his true nature well enough to fool not just Becky, but probably many other people who encountered him in his daily life. The planning and calculation evident in Evans's actions also suggest that this was not a crime of passion or a moment of temporary insanity. The systematic mutilation of Becky's body, the transportation of her remains to another state, the sending of misleading text messages, all of these actions required advanced planning and a clear understanding of their purpose. This level of premeditation is particularly chilling because it suggests that Evans may have thought about committing such a crime long before he encountered Becky. The efficiency with which he carried out the murder and attempted cover-up implies a familiarity with violence and deception that goes beyond what we might expect from a first-time killer. Yet despite all his planning and calculation, Evans made crucial mistakes that ultimately led to his capture. He left fingerprint evidence on the duct tape. He was captured on surveillance footage at the bar and on the ferry. His own vehicle contained traces of blood that connected him to the crime. These mistakes remind us that even the most careful criminals are still human, and that modern investigative techniques can often find the small traces of evidence that solve cases. As we near the end of this story, it's important to consider what lessons we can draw from the tragic case of Rebecca Coster. This is not just a story about one woman's murder, but about the broader issues of safety, vulnerability, and the unpredictable nature of evil in our society. First, this case reminds us of the importance of the text message tradition that Becky and her mother shared. Barbara's insistence that Becky text her when she got home safely was not paranoia or overprotectiveness, it was a reasonable precaution that provided valuable information to investigators. When Becky sent that final text message confirming she was home, it helped police establish a timeline for her disappearance and ultimately her murder. The case also highlights the double-edged nature of technology in modern crimes. On one hand, surveillance cameras and cell phone tracking were crucial to solving the case and bringing Evans to justice. On the other hand, Evans was able to use Becky's own phone as a weapon against her family, sending messages that prolonged their agony and misdirected the investigation. Perhaps most importantly, this case serves as a reminder that evil can wear an ordinary face. Evans Ganthier was not an obviously dangerous person who stood out in a crowd. He was someone who could engage in normal social conversation, who appeared harmless enough that a smart, responsible young woman felt comfortable giving him her phone number. This ordinariness is often the most frightening aspect of violent criminals, their ability to blend in and appear normal while harboring violent intentions. For women in particular, this case represents a terrible catch-22. We are often told to be social, to be friendly, to give people the benefit of the doubt. But we are also told to be constantly vigilant for danger, to trust our instincts, to avoid putting ourselves in vulnerable situations. The reality is that there is no perfect formula for staying safe, because predators like Evans Ganthier are skilled at exploiting normal social interactions and basic human kindness. The investigation that led to Evans's capture also demonstrates the dedication and skill of modern law enforcement. Despite the killer's elaborate attempts to destroy evidence and misdirect the investigation, detectives were able to piece together the truth through careful analysis of surveillance footage, phone records, physical evidence, and witness statements. Their work ensured that Becky's killer was brought to justice and that her family received at least some measure of closure. As we conclude this story, it's important that we remember Rebecca Coster not just as a victim of a brutal crime, but as a person who lived a full and meaningful life before it was cut short. She was a daughter who texted her mother to provide peace of mind. She was a caregiver who dedicated her days to helping vulnerable people. She was a friend who brought joy and laughter to those around her. She was a young woman who loved life and embraced it fully. The manner of Becky's death was horrific, but it should not overshadow the manner of her life. She was kind, responsible, caring, and vibrant. She made a positive difference in the lives of the elderly and disabled people she cared for. She brought happiness to her family and friends. These are the things that truly define who she was, not the terrible circumstances of her final hours. Evans Ganthier may have taken Becky's life, but he could not take away the love that people felt for her or the positive impact she had on the world during her 24 years. Her memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew her, and her story serves as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of cherishing every day we have with the people we love. For Barbara Ross, the pain of losing her daughter will never fully heal. But in seeking justice for Becky, in sharing her story, and in continuing to honor her memory, she ensures that Becky's life had meaning beyond its tragic end. In some small way, that helps make sense of a senseless crime. The case of Rebecca Coster reminds us that while evil exists in our world, so does justice. While there are people capable of unthinkable cruelty, there are also people dedicated to stopping them and ensuring they face the consequences of their actions. While innocent lives can be lost in horrific ways, the love and memory of those people endures long after their killers have been forgotten. Tonight, perhaps you'll spare a thought for Rebecca Coster, not for the terrible way she died, but for the beautiful way she lived. And perhaps you'll remember to tell the people you love how much they mean to you, because life is precious and fragile, and tomorrow is never guaranteed. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey to Green Bay, Wisconsin, where a cold February night in 2022 would forever change the lives of those touched by an unthinkable tragedy. This is the story of Shad Therian, a 24-year-old man whose life was cut short in the most horrific circumstances imaginable, and the woman who loved him, and ultimately destroyed him. So, let me tell you about a case that shocked even seasoned detectives, a story that reveals the dangerous intersection of substance abuse, toxic relationships, and violence that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. Green Bay, Wisconsin, sits quietly along the shores of Lake Michigan, known more for its football team than for violent crime. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where families gather for Sunday dinners, and where the most excitement usually comes from Packers games on crisp autumn afternoons. In this community lived Shad Therian, a young man trying to find his way in life like so many others his age. 24 years old, Shad lived with his mother, Tara Pekanik, in a modest home that had sheltered their family for years. The basement of their house had become Shad's space, his refuge from the world above. Shad wasn't perfect, few of us are at 24. He struggled with substance abuse, particularly methamphetamine, a demon that had wrapped its claws around many young people in communities across America. But despite his struggles, Shad was loved. His mother, Tara, had watched him grow from a boy with dreams into a young man battling his own darkness, never giving up hope that he would find his way back to the light. In the months leading up to February 2022, Shad had become involved with a woman named Taylor Shibbusiness. Taylor was 24 as well, roughly the same age as Shad, but their relationship was built on a foundation of shared addiction and destructive patterns that would prove catastrophic. The relationship between Shad and Taylor was intense, passionate, and ultimately toxic. They were drawn together by their mutual struggles with methamphetamine and other substances, creating a bond that was as dangerous as it was intimate. Friends and family members who knew them during this period would later describe their connection as obsessive, marked by the kind of highs and lows that characterize relationships fueled by addiction. Taylor Shibbusiness was no stranger to the criminal justice system. She had a history of legal troubles, though nothing that would have predicted the horror that was to come. Those who knew her described a woman capable of both charm and volatility, someone whose behavior could shift dramatically depending on her state of mind and level of intoxication. As winter deepened in Green Bay, Shad and Taylor's relationship continued its turbulent course. They would spend long hours together, often in the basement of Shad's mother's house, lost in their shared world of substance abuse and sexual intimacy. It was a dangerous combination, drugs that lowered inhibitions and heightened aggression, combined with the kind of intense physical relationship that could easily spiral out of control. Neither Shad nor Taylor could have known that their pattern of drug use and sexual encounters was building toward a night that would end in unthinkable violence. The basement that had been Shad's sanctuary was about to become the scene of his brutal murder. February 21, 2022, began like many other nights for Shad Therian and Taylor Shibbusiness. The winter air in Green Bay was bitter cold, the kind of cold that seems to seep into your bones and make you grateful for any warmth you can find. Inside the Pecanic home, the basement provided that warmth, along with privacy for the couple's increasingly destructive lifestyle. That evening, Shad and Taylor had obtained methamphetamine and various prescription drugs. For two people already struggling with severe addiction, this combination was like adding gasoline to a fire. The drugs they consumed would lower their inhibitions, heighten their aggression, and blur the lines between pleasure and pain in ways that would prove deadly. As the night wore on, Shad and Taylor engaged in sexual activity while under the influence of these powerful substances. What began as consensual intimacy would gradually transform into something far more sinister. The methamphetamine coursing through their systems created a dangerous cocktail of heightened arousal and diminished judgment that would prove fatal for Shad. According to Taylor's later confession to police, the sexual encounter took a violent turn when she began to strangle Shad. In her drug-addled state, she would later claim that she became aroused by the act of strangulation itself, finding pleasure in the control she wielded over Shad's breathing and, ultimately, his life. Strangulation during sexual activity, sometimes called erotic asphyxiation, is an extremely dangerous practice that has claimed countless lives. Even when practiced with safety measures and consent, it can easily go wrong. But what happened in that basement in Green Bay was not a case of a risky sexual practice gone awry, it was murder. As Shad struggled for breath beneath Taylor's hands, his body fought desperately for survival. But the combination of the drugs in his system, the physical pressure on his airway, and perhaps most importantly, Taylor's refusal to stop, sealed his fate. Minute by minute, breath by breath, Shadtherian's life slipped away in the basement where he had sought refuge from the world. When Shad finally stopped breathing, a normal person would have been horrified, would have called for help, would have tried to undo what had been done. But Taylor Shabiznes was not thinking like a normal person. The drugs in her system, combined with whatever darkness had always lurked within her, led her down a path that defies comprehension. Instead of calling 911, instead of trying to revive Shad, instead of fleeing in panic, Taylor made a decision that would shock even the most experienced law enforcement officers. She decided to dismember Shad's body. Using knives she found in the house, Taylor began the gruesome process of cutting apart the man she had just killed. This was not a crime of passion followed by panic. This was a deliberate, calculated decision to destroy evidence and, perhaps more disturbingly, to satisfy some dark urge that the drugs and violence had awakened within her. The dismemberment took hours. Taylor worked methodically, separating Shad's head from his body, cutting his torso in half, and severing his limbs. The basement that had been Shad's private space became a charnel house, soaked with blood and littered with the remains of a young man who had trusted the wrong person. But Taylor's actions that night went beyond even murder and dismemberment. According to the charges later filed against her, she sexually assaulted Shad's corpse during or after the dismemberment process. This detail, perhaps more than any other, revealed the depths of depravity to which she had sunk. As dawn approached on February 22, 2022, Taylor faced the practical problem of what to do with the evidence of her crimes. She placed Shad's severed head in a bucket and left it in the basement. His bisected torso was stuffed into a storage tote. Other body parts were scattered throughout the house and, according to some reports, placed in her vehicle for disposal elsewhere. But in her drug-addled state, Taylor had made a crucial error. She had left behind unmistakable evidence of her crimes in the very house where Shad's mother lived. It would only be a matter of time before her horrific acts were discovered. Tara Pecanic had been a mother long enough to know when something was wrong in her house. As the morning of February 22, 2022, progressed, she noticed things that didn't make sense. There were bloodstains where there shouldn't be bloodstains. There were strange odors that she couldn't identify. And most troubling of all, she couldn't find her son. Shad had been staying in the basement, and while it wasn't unusual for him to keep irregular hours due to his struggles with addiction, something about this particular morning felt different. The silence from downstairs was too complete, too final. A mother's instinct told Tara that something terrible had happened. As she searched the house for answers, Tara's investigation led her to the basement. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her life and require years of therapy to process. In a bucket, barely concealed and impossible to mistake for anything else, was her son's severed head. The discovery of such horror in one's own home, involving one's own child, is something that no parent should ever have to endure. Tara's world collapsed in that instant, as the reality of what had happened to Shed became brutally clear. But even in her shock and grief, she managed to do what needed to be done. She called 911. The emergency call that came into the Green Bay Police Department that morning was unlike anything the dispatchers had heard before. A distraught mother reporting that she had found her son's head in a bucket in her basement was the kind of call that even experienced emergency responders struggled to process. But the police who responded to the Pecanic home would quickly learn that this was no hoax, no mistake, no misunderstanding. The first officers to arrive at the scene were young, relatively inexperienced patrol officers who had never encountered anything approaching this level of violence and depravity. What they found in that basement would traumatize them and require extensive counseling to help them cope with the psychological impact of the scene. The basement was a horrific tableau of violence. Blood-covered surfaces throughout the room. Shad's severed head was indeed in a bucket, exactly as his mother had reported. But that was only the beginning of the horror. As officers searched the scene more thoroughly, they discovered additional body parts in various containers and locations throughout the basement and house. The medical examiner who was called to process the scene would later testify that in his many years of investigating violent deaths, he had never encountered a case quite like this one. The deliberate, methodical nature of the dismemberment suggested a level of calculation that went far beyond a crime of passion. This was something else entirely, something that spoke to a darkness that most people cannot comprehend. As the investigation expanded beyond the initial crime scene, police began to piece together what had happened during those terrible hours in February. Physical evidence, including DNA, fingerprints, and witness statements, would eventually paint a clear picture of the events that led to Shad's death and dismemberment. But even as the evidence mounted, investigators struggled to understand the motivation behind such extreme violence. What could drive someone to not only kill another human being but to dismember their body and scatter the parts like refuse? The answer to that question would come from an unlikely source, Taylor Shivers herself. While investigators processed the crime scene and began their methodical collection of evidence, they also launched a search for Taylor Shivers, who had seemingly vanished after the murder. But Taylor hadn't gone far. In fact, she was still in the Green Bay area, apparently making little effort to avoid detection or flee the jurisdiction. When police located and arrested Taylor on February 23, 2022, they found her in possession of additional evidence linking her to the crime. According to some reports, parts of Shad's body were found in her vehicle, suggesting that she had been in the process of disposing of the remains when she was apprehended. During her initial police interview, Taylor displayed a shocking lack of remorse or emotional response to the gravity of her situation. Officers who questioned her described her demeanor as cold, detached, and at times almost amused by the horror she had caused. This was not the behavior of someone who had committed a crime of passion and was now racked with guilt. This was something else entirely. But perhaps most shocking of all was Taylor's willingness to confess to the crimes in detail. Rather than denying her involvement or attempting to minimize her actions, Taylor provided investigators with a comprehensive account of how she had killed and dismembered Shed. According to her confession, Taylor admitted that she had strangled Shed to death during sexual intercourse while they were both intoxicated with methamphetamine and prescription drugs. She described becoming sexually aroused by the act of strangulation and continuing to apply pressure to Shad's neck even after it became clear that he was in distress. But the confession went beyond just the murder itself. Taylor also admitted to dismembering Shad's body after his death, describing the process in clinical detail that shocked even experienced detectives. She spoke of using knives to separate his head from his body, cutting his torso in half, and severing his limbs as if she were describing a routine household task. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Taylor admitted to sexually assaulting Shad's corpse during or after the dismemberment process. This revelation added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime and provided insight into the depths of Taylor's psychological disturbance. Throughout her confession, Taylor showed little emotion or remorse for her actions. She spoke matter-of-factly about ending Shad's life and desecrating his body, as if these were normal responses to a sexual encounter gone wrong. This lack of empathy or recognition of the gravity of her actions would become a central theme throughout her subsequent legal proceedings. The confession also revealed the role that drugs had played in the crime. Taylor acknowledged that she and Shed had both consumed significant quantities of methamphetamine and prescription drugs before and during the sexual encounter that led to his death. While substance abuse cannot excuse the horrific nature of her crimes, it provided some context for understanding how the situation had escalated so dramatically. But even taking the drug use into account, investigators and prosecutors struggled to understand how someone could commit such extreme acts of violence against another human being. The dismemberment alone would have taken hours to complete and required a sustained commitment to the destruction of Shad's body that went far beyond what might be explained by intoxication alone. As news of Taylor's confession spread throughout the Green Bay community and beyond, people struggled to comprehend how such evil could exist in their midst. The case became a stark reminder that even in seemingly safe communities, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to emerge. Following her arrest and confession, Taylor Schabusiness was formally charged with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and third-degree sexual assault. These charges reflected the multiple layers of criminality involved in her actions against Shadtherian, from the initial murder through the subsequent desecration of his body. The case presented unique challenges for both the prosecution and the defense. While Taylor's confession provided a clear admission of guilt, her defense team faced the difficult task of mounting a defense for someone who had committed such heinous acts. The obvious avenue was to argue that Taylor's mental state at the time of the crime, influenced by severe drug intoxication, should be considered as a mitigating factor. However, establishing an insanity defense or claiming diminished capacity due to drug use is extremely difficult in cases where the defendant's actions show clear premeditation and calculation. The fact that Taylor had methodically dismembered Shad's body over the course of several hours suggested a level of deliberate thought that undermined claims of temporary insanity or drug-induced psychosis. The prosecution, meanwhile, faced the challenge of presenting evidence of Taylor's crimes to a jury without traumatizing them to the point where they could not render a fair verdict. The physical evidence from the crime scene was so graphic and disturbing that special procedures had to be put in place to protect both the jurors and the court personnel who would be exposed to it. One of the key issues that emerged during the pre-trial proceedings was Taylor's competency to stand trial. Given the extreme nature of her crimes and her apparent lack of remorse or emotional response, questions were raised about whether she was mentally capable of understanding the charges against her and assisting in her own defense. Court-appointed mental health experts conducted extensive evaluations of Taylor's psychological state. These evaluations revealed a complex picture of someone who was clearly capable of understanding the legal proceedings against her but who also displayed significant psychological abnormalities that had contributed to her criminal behavior. The competency hearings provided additional insight into Taylor's mental state at the time of the crime and in the months following her arrest. Expert witnesses testified about the effects of chronic methamphetamine use on brain function and behavior, providing context for understanding how Taylor's long-term drug abuse may have contributed to her capacity for such extreme violence. But even with this psychological context, the experts ultimately concluded that Taylor was competent to stand trial. She understood the nature of the charges against her, she was capable of communicating with her attorneys, and she could participate in her own defense. The fact that she had committed incomprehensible acts of violence did not, in itself, render her incompetent to face trial for those acts. As the case moved toward trial, the Green Bay community and the nation watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. The details of the case were so extreme that they seemed to belong in a horror movie rather than in a real courtroom. But for Shadtherian's family and friends, this was all too real, and their quest for justice was just beginning. In July 2023, more than a year after Shadtherian's brutal murder, Taylor Shibbusiness finally faced trial for her crimes. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, law enforcement officers, and members of the public who had followed the case since the initial reports of the horrific discovery in the basement of the Pecanic home. The prosecution's case was straightforward but deeply disturbing. They presented physical evidence from the crime scene, including photographs and DNA analysis that conclusively linked Taylor to the murder and dismemberment of Shad. They also played portions of Taylor's confession, allowing the jury to hear in her own words how she had killed Shad and then desecrated his body. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Tara Pecanic, Shad's mother, who took the witness stand to describe the morning when she discovered her son's severed head in a bucket in her basement. Her testimony was heart-wrenching, as she described not only the physical horror of finding her child's remains but also the emotional devastation of losing him in such a terrible way. Tara spoke about Shad as a person, not just as a victim. She described his struggles with addiction but also his capacity for love and his efforts to overcome his demons. She painted a picture of a young man who had made mistakes but who deserved so much more than the fate that Taylor had inflicted upon him. The medical examiner's testimony provided clinical details about the cause of Shad's death and the nature of his injuries. The examiner explained that Shad had died from strangulation, but that the dismemberment had been performed after death using multiple sharp instruments. The methodical nature of the dismemberment, the examiner testified, suggested that it had taken considerable time and effort to complete. One of the most challenging aspects of the trial was the presentation of crime scene photographs and other physical evidence. The judge implemented special procedures to protect the jury from unnecessary trauma while still allowing them to see the evidence necessary to understand the full scope of Taylor's crimes. Even with these protections, several jurors were visibly shaken by what they saw and heard during the proceedings. The defense team faced an almost impossible task. With Taylor's confession and the overwhelming physical evidence against her, they could not realistically argue that she was innocent of the crimes. Instead, they focused on trying to explain her actions as the result of severe mental illness exacerbated by chronic drug abuse. Defense witnesses included mental health experts who testified about the effects of methamphetamine on brain function and behavior. They argued that Taylor's long-term drug use had fundamentally altered her ability to control her impulses and understand the consequences of her actions. While this testimony provided some context for understanding Taylor's behavior, it did little to excuse the calculated nature of her crimes. Throughout the trial, Taylor's behavior in the courtroom was erratic and disturbing. At times she appeared engaged and attentive, but at other moments she seemed disconnected from the proceedings, as if she were watching someone else's trial rather than her own. This behavior only reinforced the prosecution's argument that she was a dangerous individual who posed a continuing threat to society. The trial also included testimony from law enforcement officers who had responded to the scene and conducted the investigation. These officers described the impact that the case had on them personally and professionally, noting that even experienced investigators had struggled to cope with the extreme nature of the violence they encountered. As the evidence phase of the trial concluded, both sides prepared for closing arguments. The prosecution would argue that Taylor's crimes were so heinous and calculated that only the most severe punishment would serve the interests of justice. The defense would make one final plea for mercy, arguing that Taylor's mental illness and drug addiction should be considered as mitigating factors in her sentencing. After deliberating for several hours, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all charges. Taylor Shibbusiness was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and third-degree sexual assault in the death of Shadtherian. The verdict was not surprising given the overwhelming evidence against her, but it brought a sense of closure to Shad's family and the community that had been traumatized by the case. The conviction on the first-degree homicide charge carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison. The only question remaining was whether Taylor would be eligible for parole at some point in the future or whether she would spend the rest of her life behind bars with no possibility of release. During the sentencing hearing in September 2023, Shad's family members were given the opportunity to address the court and to speak directly to Taylor about the impact her crimes had on their lives. Their victim impact statements were powerful and emotional, describing not only their grief over Shad's death but also their ongoing trauma from the horrific manner in which he was killed. Tara Pekanik spoke about the nightmares that continued to plague her, the therapy she required to cope with what she had seen in her basement, and the way that Taylor's actions had forever changed her ability to feel safe in her own home. She described the ongoing process of grieving for her son while also trying to heal from the trauma of discovering his remains in such a shocking manner. Other family members and friends spoke about Shad's potential that would never be realized, the memories they would never make with him, and the hole his death had left in their lives. They described him as someone who was struggling with addiction but who was also capable of love, kindness, and growth. Taylor's actions had not only ended his life but had done so in a way that denied him any dignity in death. When it came time for Taylor to address the court, her response was as disturbing as her crimes had been. Rather than expressing remorse or acknowledging the pain she had caused, Taylor's statement was largely focused on herself and her own grievances. She showed little understanding of or concern for the impact her actions had on Shad's family and friends. This lack of remorse played a significant role in the judge's sentencing decision. In imposing a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, the judge noted that Taylor's crimes were among the most heinous he had encountered in his years on the bench. The calculated nature of the dismemberment, the sexual assault of a corpse, and Taylor's continued lack of remorse all contributed to the decision to ensure that she would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. The sentence brought a measure of justice for Shadtherian and his family, but it could not undo the horror of what had been done to him. The case would continue to reverberate throughout the Green Bay community and beyond, serving as a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity and the importance of addressing the underlying issues of addiction and mental illness that can contribute to such tragic outcomes. In the months following the sentencing, Shad's family worked to establish a memorial in his honor and to advocate for better resources for those struggling with addiction. They spoke publicly about the need for more comprehensive treatment programs and support systems that might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The case also prompted discussions about the role of the media in covering such extreme crimes. While the public had a legitimate interest in understanding what had happened and seeing justice served, the graphic nature of the evidence raised questions about how much detail should be shared with the public and what impact such coverage might have on both the victims' families and potential copycat criminals. The murder of Shadtherian by Taylor Schabusiness stands as one of the most horrific crimes in Wisconsin's recent history. The case shocked even experienced law enforcement officers and mental health professionals who thought they had seen the worst of human behavior. But beyond the horror and sensationalism, the case offers important lessons about addiction, mental illness, and the deadly combination of substance abuse and violence. Methamphetamine addiction played a central role in this tragedy. Both Shad and Taylor were struggling with severe addiction to this highly dangerous drug, which is known to cause paranoia, violent behavior, and profound changes in brain chemistry. The combination of methamphetamine with other drugs created a toxic cocktail that lowered inhibitions and heightened aggression in ways that proved fatal. The case also highlights the complex relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior. While Taylor's psychological disturbances may help explain her capacity for such extreme violence, they do not excuse or justify her actions. Many people struggle with mental illness without ever harming others, and the vast majority of people with mental health conditions are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. The role of toxic relationships in escalating violence is another important aspect of this case. Shad and Taylor's relationship was built on a foundation of shared addiction and destructive behavior patterns that created a dangerous dynamic. When substance abuse, sexual behavior, and violence intersect in such relationships, the results can be catastrophic. For Shad's family, the case represents not just the loss of a loved one but also a profound trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives. Tara Pekanika's discovery of her son's remains was an experience that no parent should ever have to endure, and her journey toward healing continues to this day. The case also raises questions about the criminal justice system's ability to deal with such extreme cases. While Taylor's conviction and sentencing provided a measure of justice, the legal system struggled to find adequate ways to address the psychological and emotional impact of her crimes on all those affected. Law enforcement officers who worked on the case required extensive counseling and support to deal with the trauma of investigating such a horrific crime. The images and evidence they processed during the investigation left lasting psychological scars that reminded everyone involved of the human cost of such violence. The media coverage of the case walked a difficult line between informing the public and sensationalizing tragedy. While the community had a right to know about the crime and its resolution, the graphic nature of the evidence raised questions about the appropriate level of detail to share with the public. Perhaps most importantly, the case serves as a reminder of the need for better resources and support systems for those struggling with addiction and mental illness. While we cannot predict or prevent every act of violence, we can work to address the underlying factors that contribute to such tragedies. Addiction treatment programs, mental health services, and support systems for families affected by these issues are all critical components of a comprehensive approach to preventing similar tragedies. Shadtherian's death cannot be undone, but his memory can serve as a catalyst for positive change in how we address these challenging social issues. As we come to the end of this difficult story, it's important to remember that Shadtherian was more than just a victim of a horrific crime. He was a son, a friend, and a young man who was struggling to find his way in life. His battle with addiction did not define him, and his death should not overshadow the person he was and the potential he possessed. Those who knew Shed remember his smile, his humor, and his capacity for kindness even in his darkest moments. They remember someone who was trying to overcome his demons, even if he ultimately lost that battle in the most tragic way possible. His family continues to honor his memory while working to heal from the trauma of his loss. The case of Shadtherian's murder reminds us that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life mattered, whose death left a void that can never be filled, and whose memory deserves to be honored with dignity and respect. As we reflect on this tragedy, we should remember not just the horror of how Shed died, but the person he was and the love he shared with those around him. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the day's troubles fade and we find peace in the darkness, we can remember Shadtherian not as a victim of unspeakable violence, but as a young man who deserved so much more than the fate that befell him. His story serves as a reminder of our shared humanity and the importance of treating each other with compassion, understanding, and love. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we journey to the Rust Belt city of Cleveland, Ohio, where in the summer of 2013, a discovery would shock a community already hardened by urban decay and violence. This is the story of Michael Madison, a man whose troubled past led to a horrific series of crimes that would forever change the lives of 3 families and expose the dark underbelly of East Cleveland's forgotten neighborhoods. So, let me take you through this haunting tale of tragedy, investigation, and justice. The story unfolds slowly, like the humid summer nights when these crimes took place, where the air hung heavy with secrets and the sound of distant sirens was as common as crickets. It was July 19, 2013, and the morning air in East Cleveland was already thick with humidity. The cable television company employees arriving for work at their office building noticed something that made them stop in their tracks, a putrid, unmistakable odor emanating from the garage behind their building. The smell was getting stronger each day, and finally, someone decided to call the police. Police discovered a large garbage bag jammed between Madison's car and the wall. Inside the bag was the decomposing body of Sherelda Terry, 18, who had met Madison about a week before she was last seen alive. Officer Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the East Cleveland Police Department, had encountered many unpleasant situations in his career, but nothing quite prepared him for what he found that morning. The garage was cramped and cluttered, used by several tenants of the building above, including a man named Michael Madison who lived in a second-floor apartment. As Martinez and his partner carefully approached the source of the smell, they discovered what appeared to be a large trash bag wedged between a beat-up sedan and the concrete wall. The bag was sealed, but the contents had begun to decompose in the summer heat. When they opened it, they found the body of a young woman, later identified as 18-year-old Shirelda Terry. But this was just the beginning. Searching further, the police found another trash bag in a brush pile behind the garage. The second discovery sent chills down the spines of even the most experienced officers. Inside this bag was another victim, and as the investigation expanded, a third body would soon be found. The discovery of these 3 women, all wrapped in plastic bags and disposed of like garbage, would launch one of the most disturbing serial killer investigations in Cleveland's recent history. The bodies were found wrapped in plastic bags less than 200 yards from each other. Let's take a moment to remember the 3 women whose lives were tragically cut short. Each had their own story, their own dreams, and their own struggles in a city that often forgot about people like them. Madison was sentenced to die in 2016 for the aggravated murders of 38-year-old Angela Deskins, 28-year-old Shedisha Sheely and 18-year-old Shirelda Terry. Shirelda Terry was the youngest victim at just 18 years old. She was a young woman trying to find her way in the world, navigating the challenges of growing up in East Cleveland's tough neighborhoods. Terry was last seen in July 2013. Those who knew her described her as someone who was always trying to help others, despite facing her own difficulties. Shedisha Sheely was 28 years old when she disappeared. Sheely had disappeared in September 2012. This means her body had been concealed for nearly 10 months before being discovered. Shedisha had been missing for the longest period, and her family had spent almost a year wondering what happened to their loved one, holding on to hope that somehow she would return. Angela Deskins, 38 years old, was the oldest of the 3 victims. Deskins had been missing since June 2013. She had been missing for only about a month before her body was discovered. Angela was known in the neighborhood as someone who struggled with addiction but was trying to turn her life around. All 3 women were vulnerable in different ways, young, dealing with personal challenges, and living in an area where people sometimes disappeared without much notice from the broader community. They were exactly the type of victims that predators often target, women whose disappearances might not immediately trigger massive search efforts or media attention. As investigators processed the crime scenes and began piecing together the timeline, one name kept surfacing: Michael Madison. He lived in the apartment directly above where the first body was found, and he had access to the garage where Shirelda Terry's remains were discovered. Michael Madison, born October 15, 1977, is an American serial killer and rapist from East Cleveland, Ohio, who is known to have committed the murders of at least 3 women over a 9-month period in 2012 and 2013. Madison was 35 years old at the time of his arrest, a registered sex offender with a criminal history that painted a picture of an increasingly dangerous individual. But to understand how Michael Madison became capable of such horrific crimes, we need to look back at his troubled childhood and the cycle of violence that shaped his early years. Madison was born on October 15, 1977, to Diane Madison and John Baldwin, the product of an accidental pregnancy. Baldwin denied that he was the father and had no contact with Madison. From the very beginning, Michael's life was marked by rejection and instability. Growing up, Madison was severely abused by his mother, as well as her boyfriends. The details of this abuse, while not fully disclosed in court records, were severe enough to leave lasting psychological scars. Child abuse experts often point out that severe childhood trauma can, in some cases, contribute to the development of violent behavior later in life, though it's important to note that the vast majority of abuse survivors never harm others. This pattern of violence in Madison's formative years created a deeply troubled individual who would eventually channel his pain and rage toward innocent victims. By the time he reached adulthood, Madison had already begun exhibiting concerning behavior that led to his registration as a sex offender. With 3 bodies discovered and a prime suspect identified, the East Cleveland Police Department launched a comprehensive investigation. Detective Sarah Williams, who would lead the case, knew she was dealing with something far more serious than the typical violent crimes that plagued the area. The investigation revealed disturbing details about Madison's methods. Madison killed his victims using ligature strangulation. This means he tied them with ropes or cords to take their lives. After killing them, he wrapped their bodies in plastic bags and left them in various locations near his apartment. The method of killing, ligature strangulation, is particularly chilling because it requires sustained effort and intention. Unlike a crime of passion that might result in a quick, violent act, ligature strangulation involves a deliberate process that can take several minutes. This suggests a level of premeditation and coldness that sent shivers through the investigative team. What made the case even more disturbing was the time frame involved. Madison is known to have committed the murders of at least 3 women over a 9-month period in 2012 and 2013. This wasn't a single incident or even a brief crime spree. Madison had been killing women for almost a year, storing their bodies, and continuing to live his daily life as if nothing had happened. The logistics of concealing 3 bodies for extended periods while living in a densely populated area raised questions about Madison's mental state and planning abilities. Neighbors would later report that they had noticed occasional foul odors but attributed them to garbage or other urban smells common in the area. Following the discovery of the bodies, law enforcement moved quickly to arrest Michael Madison. Madison, 35, a convicted sex offender, already was charged with aggravated murder and kidnapping. The charges reflected not just the murders themselves, but also the evidence that the victims had been held against their will before being killed. Michael Madison, accused of killing 3 women then wrapping their bodies in trash bags, has been indicted on 14 counts including aggravated murder and kidnapping. The extensive list of charges demonstrated the prosecutor's intention to seek the maximum penalty for these heinous crimes. During questioning, Madison's responses were as disturbing as his crimes. Madison confessed to choking a woman to death in October 2012, then leaving her in his apartment while he went out drinking. Madison claimed he did not recall killing the 2 others, but did say he recalled waking up next to the dead body of one of the women, which he later put in a garage behind his home. This confession revealed the cold, casual nature of Madison's crimes. The idea that he could kill a woman and then go out drinking, leaving her body in his apartment, speaks to a level of detachment and lack of empathy that few people can comprehend. His claim of not remembering the other murders while remembering waking up next to a dead body suggests either severe mental health issues or a calculated attempt to avoid full responsibility for his actions. The investigation also revealed the extended timeline of Madison's crimes and his ability to function normally while concealing evidence of murder. For months, he went about his daily routine, interacting with neighbors, running errands, maintaining relationships, all while keeping the bodies of his victims hidden nearby. The discovery of 3 bodies in East Cleveland sent shockwaves through a community already struggling with high crime rates and economic challenges. East Cleveland, a suburb of Cleveland proper, had long dealt with urban decay, poverty, and violence, but the revelation of a serial killer operating in their midst brought a new level of fear and attention. A search of vacant and abandoned houses in a Cleveland, Ohio, suburb for more possible victims came up empty today. The fact that authorities felt compelled to search additional locations for more victims underscores the gravity of the situation and the fear that Madison might have killed more women. For the families of the victims, the discovery brought both relief and renewed anguish. After months of not knowing what happened to their loved ones, they finally had answers, but those answers were far worse than many had imagined. The grief of losing a family member was compounded by the horrific nature of their deaths and the realization that their loved ones had suffered before dying. The case also highlighted ongoing issues in East Cleveland and similar communities across America. The victims were all vulnerable women, and their disappearances initially didn't receive the same level of attention that might be given to missing persons from more affluent areas. This disparity in how missing persons cases are handled has been a persistent issue in law enforcement, often referred to as missing white woman syndrome, though in this case, it was more about socio-economic status and perceived social value. Community leaders used the tragedy as an opportunity to call for better resources for missing persons investigations and more support for vulnerable populations. They also emphasized the need for neighbors to look out for one another and report suspicious activities, as several people had noticed the foul odors but initially dismissed them. When Michael Madison's case went to trial, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecution presented a methodical case that detailed not only the physical evidence linking Madison to the crimes but also his confession and the timeline of events. Madison's defense attorney did not claim Madison was innocent, but raised 20 issues on appeal, claiming improper trial procedures denied him the right to receive a life sentence in prison. This approach by the defense, not arguing innocence but rather procedural issues, reflected the strength of the evidence against Madison. The defense strategy focused on Madison's troubled childhood and mental health issues, arguing that these factors should be considered as mitigating circumstances that would justify a life sentence rather than the death penalty. They painted a picture of a man who had been broken by years of abuse and neglect, suggesting that while his crimes were inexcusable, his background provided context for his actions. The prosecution, however, emphasized the deliberate and sustained nature of Madison's crimes. They argued that regardless of his background, Madison had made conscious choices to kill 3 innocent women and then dispose of their bodies like garbage. They highlighted the suffering of the victims and the impact on their families and community. He was arrested and charged with the crimes in 2013 and was sentenced to death in 2016. The jury ultimately decided that the aggravating factors of Madison's crimes outweighed any mitigating circumstances from his background. The death sentence reflected the jury's conclusion that Madison's crimes were among the most serious possible under Ohio law. The deliberate nature of the killings, the vulnerable status of the victims, and the extended period over which the crimes occurred all contributed to this decision. Following his conviction and death sentence, Madison's case entered the lengthy appeals process that characterizes death penalty cases in the United States. The Ohio Supreme Court has stayed the execution of convicted East Cleveland serial killer Michael Madison, who was scheduled to be put to death in May. Justices on Wednesday ordered Madison's execution to be put off until he has exhausted all appeals and state post-conviction proceedings. This stay of execution is routine in death penalty cases and reflects the careful review process that courts undertake in capital cases. The appeals process can take many years or even decades, during which time various legal issues are examined and re-examined. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled on various aspects of Madison's appeal, but the legal process continues. The multiple levels of appeal in death penalty cases are designed to ensure that no reversible errors were made during the original trial and that the sentence is appropriate given the crimes committed. While Madison sits on death row, his case continues to impact the families of his victims and the East Cleveland community. The extended legal process, while necessary for ensuring justice, can be difficult for families who wish to see closure but must instead endure years of continued legal proceedings and media attention. In a bizarre and tragic twist to an already horrific story, serial killer Michael Madison's mother was killed and 3 children were injured in a stabbing on Cleveland's East Side early Saturday morning in 2019. The 67-year-old woman was later identified as Diane Madison. This additional tragedy added another layer to the Madison family's dark legacy. The woman who had allegedly abused Michael during his childhood had herself become a victim of violence. The circumstances of Diane Madison's death were unrelated to her son's crimes, but the violent end to her life seemed to underscore the cycle of violence that had marked the Madison family for generations. The irony was not lost on those familiar with the case. The mother whose abuse may have contributed to creating a serial killer had herself died violently. While it's important not to suggest that Diane Madison deserved her fate, the tragedy highlighted how violence tends to perpetuate itself through families and communities. As we reach the end of this dark tale, it's worth reflecting on the broader lessons that can be drawn from the Michael Madison case. This story is not just about one man's descent into evil, but about systemic failures that allowed vulnerable women to become victims and a troubled individual to become a killer. The case highlights the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously, regardless of the perceived social status of the missing individual. All three of Madison's victims were women whose disappearances might not have generated immediate widespread attention, but each represented a life of value and family members who loved them. It also underscores the complex relationship between childhood abuse and later violence. While the vast majority of abuse survivors never harm others, the severe trauma in Madison's early life likely contributed to his psychological development. This doesn't excuse his crimes, but it does suggest the importance of early intervention and support for children experiencing abuse. The case further demonstrates the critical role that community awareness plays in public safety. The foul odors that emanated from the storage locations of Madison's victims were noticed by multiple people, but no one took action to investigate. While it's understandable that people might dismiss unusual smells in an urban environment, the case suggests the value of community members being alert to signs that something might be seriously wrong. From a law enforcement perspective, the Madison case shows both the challenges and successes of investigating serial crimes. The East Cleveland Police Department, working with limited resources in a high-crime area, was able to quickly identify and arrest Madison once the bodies were discovered. The investigation was thorough and professional, resulting in a conviction that has withstood years of appeals. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you might wonder how someone becomes capable of such horrific crimes. The truth is that there are no simple answers. The interplay of genetics, childhood experiences, mental health, and personal choices creates complex patterns that even experts struggle to fully understand. What we do know is that Michael Madison's crimes represent a profound failure, not just of one individual, but of systems designed to protect children, support vulnerable adults, and maintain community safety. His story serves as a reminder that evil can lurk behind ordinary facades and that the price of safety is eternal vigilance. The three women who died at Madison's hands, Sherelda Terry, Shedisha Sheely, and Angela Deskins, deserved better from life. They deserved to live, to love, to pursue their dreams, and to die naturally in old age surrounded by family. Instead, their lives were cut short by a man who saw them not as human beings worthy of respect and care, but as objects to be used and discarded. Tonight, as you sleep safely in your bed, remember their names and their stories. Remember that behind every true crime case are real people whose lives mattered, whose deaths created ripples of grief that continue to this day, and whose memories deserve to be honored. In the quiet darkness of your room, let their stories remind you of the preciousness of life and the importance of looking out for one another. In a world where people like Michael Madison exist, the rest of us must be the light that guards against the darkness. The East Cleveland serial killer case closed with justice served, but the scars remain. Madison sits on death row, his appeals continuing through the courts, while the families of his victims carry on with lives forever changed by his actions. The community of East Cleveland continues to struggle with the challenges that existed before Madison's crimes and that persist after his capture. I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the quiet suburban community of Loganville, Georgia, nestled in the rolling hills of Gwinnett County, families settled into their homes each evening with the comforting assumption that their loved ones would be safe through the night. It was a place where children rode their bikes on tree-lined streets, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where the most serious crime might be a speeding ticket or a minor theft. But on the evening of July 5, 2017, that sense of security would be shattered forever by an act so unthinkable, so deeply disturbing, that it would haunt investigators, first responders, and the community for years to come. This is the story of Isabel Martinez, a 33-year-old mother who, in the darkness of a summer night, would systematically end the lives of 4 of her 5 children and her husband, leaving behind a trail of devastation that defied comprehension. It's a case that forces us to confront the most uncomfortable questions about mental illness, family dynamics, and the thin line that sometimes separates protector from predator. To understand the horror that unfolded that night, we must first understand the family that Isabel Martinez destroyed. Martin Martinez Sr. was a hard-working man who had built a life in Georgia with Isabel, believing in the promise of the American dream. Together, they had created what appeared from the outside to be a typical immigrant family, working to establish themselves in their adopted country. Their home was filled with the laughter and chaos that comes with 5 children. There was Diana Romero, 9 years old, a bright girl who loved school and had dreams that stretched far beyond the confines of their suburban neighborhood. Then came Dakota, whose young voice would soon be silenced forever. Martin Jr. carried his father's name with pride, a boy who was just beginning to discover his place in the world. Axel, one of the youngest, was still in that precious stage where everything was an adventure, where trust came naturally, and where the word "mommy" was synonymous with safety and love. And there was Isabella, the baby of the family, whose life had barely begun before it would be brutally ended. These weren't just statistics or victims in a case file. They were children with personalities, with favorite toys, with inside jokes they shared with their siblings. They had bedtime routines, favorite foods, and dreams about what they wanted to be when they grew up. Diana, the eldest, sometimes helped her mother with her younger siblings, showing the kind of responsibility that eldest children often develop. The boys roughhoused and played together, creating the kind of memories that should have lasted a lifetime. And little Isabella was just beginning to walk, to form her first words, to discover the world around her. Martin Sr. worked long hours to provide for his large family. Like many immigrant fathers, he understood that success in America required sacrifice, and he was willing to work multiple jobs if necessary to ensure his children had opportunities he never had. He was a man who believed in family loyalty, in hard work, and in the possibility that his children would achieve more than he ever could. From the outside, the Martinez family seemed to be navigating the challenges of raising 5 children with the same struggles and joys that characterized countless other families. There were financial pressures, certainly, and the logistics of managing such a large household were undoubtedly challenging. But neighbors would later recall seeing the children playing in the yard, hearing the normal sounds of family life emanating from their home. There were no obvious warning signs, no dramatic incidents that would have predicted the nightmare that was approaching. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary family life, something was beginning to fracture within Isabel Martinez's mind. In the weeks leading up to the murders, there were subtle changes in her behavior that, while perhaps not alarming at the time, would later be recognized as symptoms of a severe mental health crisis. Family members would later recall that Isabel had been struggling with grief over her father's recent death. She had been lighting candles and praying intensely, spending hours in what appeared to be deep spiritual contemplation. For many people, turning to faith during times of loss is a normal and healthy coping mechanism. But for Isabel, these religious practices seemed to be taking on an increasingly obsessive quality. She began speaking about spiritual matters in ways that concerned those close to her. There were mentions of feeling the presence of evil forces, of sensing spiritual battles taking place around her. She talked about demons and divine messages, conversations that made family members uncomfortable but that they initially attributed to grief and stress. In many cultures, discussions of spiritual warfare and supernatural influences are not uncommon, so her relatives may have seen her behavior as intense but not necessarily dangerous. During a family trip in the days before the murders, Isabel confided to investigators later that she had felt a devil-like spirit surrounding her and her family. This wasn't just garden-variety anxiety or depression, this was the emergence of what mental health professionals would recognize as psychotic thinking. She was beginning to lose touch with reality, to see threats and spiritual forces that existed only in her deteriorating mental state. The tragedy of cases like this is that the warning signs are often clear only in hindsight. While Isabel was experiencing these disturbing thoughts and spiritual delusions, her family saw a grieving woman struggling with loss. They may have been concerned, but they couldn't have predicted that her mental state was deteriorating to the point where she would become a danger to the very children she had given birth to and raised. It's important to understand that psychotic breaks don't typically happen overnight. They often develop gradually, with the affected person's grip on reality slowly loosening until they can no longer distinguish between their delusions and the real world. For Isabel, the combination of grief, possible underlying mental illness, and whatever other stressors were present in her life created a perfect storm that would have devastating consequences. July 5, 2017, began like any other summer evening in the Martinez household. The children had eaten dinner, played for a while, and were beginning their bedtime routines. Martin Sr. was likely tired from work, looking forward to a few quiet hours before bed and the prospect of sleeping in slightly on his day off. The house settled into the familiar rhythms of a family preparing for the night. As darkness fell over Loganville, the Martinez children were tucked into their beds, probably with the usual requests for one more story, one more drink of water, one more hug. Diana, being the oldest, may have stayed up a bit later than her younger siblings, but eventually, she too would have surrendered to sleep. Martin Sr. and Isabel went to bed, and for a few hours, the house was peaceful. But sometime in the early morning hours of July 6, while her family slept trustingly around her, Isabel Martinez began to implement a plan so horrific that it defies rational explanation. According to the account given later by 9-year-old Diana, the sole survivor, everyone was asleep when her mother began her methodical attack. Isabel's first victim was little Axel, one of the youngest children. In what can only be described as a scene from a nightmare, she entered his room while he slept and began stabbing him with a knife. The child woke up during the attack, no doubt confused and terrified beyond imagination. But instead of stopping, instead of coming to her senses when she saw the fear in her own child's eyes, Isabel covered his nose and mouth until he suffocated. The little boy who had once run to her for comfort when he had a bad dream was now dying at her hands. The horror didn't end there. Isabel moved methodically through the house, entering each of her children's rooms like an angel of death. When she reached Dakota's room, the child awakened during the attack and, in words that would haunt investigators forever, cried out, "No, Mommy, no." Even in her final moments, Dakota was calling for the person who should have protected her, the person who was supposed to love her more than life itself. Instead of mercy, instead of recognition of what she was doing, Isabel silenced her daughter permanently. One by one, she killed her children. Each room became a crime scene. Each small body represented not just a life ended, but a future erased, dreams destroyed, potential obliterated. These weren't quick, impersonal deaths. These were prolonged, intimate acts of violence committed by the one person these children trusted above all others. When Isabel reached Diana's room, she told her daughter that she loved her and asked for her forgiveness before cutting her. In what may have been her most chilling statement, she told 9-year-old Diana that she was going to the sky to see Jesus. The terrified child cried and told her mother she didn't want to go see Jesus, didn't want to die. But unlike her siblings, Diana would survive the attack, though she would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of her life. The final victim was Martin Sr., the father who had worked so hard to provide for his family. When he heard the commotion and tried to seek help, tried perhaps to save whatever family members he could, Isabel turned the knife on him as well. The man who had shared her bed, who had created these children with her, who had trusted her with his life and the lives of their children, became her final victim. As dawn broke over Loganville on July 6, 2017, the Martinez house sat silent and still. Inside, 4 children and their father lay dead, while 9-year-old Diana clung to life despite her injuries. Neighbors who would normally have heard the sounds of children getting ready for the day heard nothing. There were no breakfast preparations, no cartoons playing on television, no children's voices calling out to their parents. When first responders arrived at the scene, they encountered something that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. Seasoned police officers and paramedics, people who had seen car accidents, domestic violence scenes, and other tragedies, found themselves unprepared for the systematic destruction of an entire family. The house that should have been filled with the energy and chaos of 5 children was instead a tomb, each room telling the story of trust betrayed and innocence destroyed. Diana was rushed to the hospital, her physical wounds severe but her emotional trauma immeasurable. She had not only survived an attempt on her life by her own mother, but she had also witnessed the murders of her siblings. The psychological impact of such an experience on a 9-year-old child is difficult to comprehend. She had lost her entire family in one night and had been betrayed by the person she should have been able to trust most. Isabel Martinez was taken into custody, and her behavior even in the immediate aftermath of the murders was deeply disturbing. When she appeared in court just one day after the killings, she smiled and waved at news cameras, displaying a complete disconnection from the gravity of what she had done. This wasn't the behavior of someone experiencing remorse or shock. This was the behavior of someone whose grip on reality had completely shattered. As investigators began to piece together what had happened in the Martinez home, they were faced with trying to understand not just the mechanics of the crime, but the mindset that could have led to such an act. The evidence was overwhelming, there was no question about who had committed these murders. But the question of why remained complex and troubling. During interviews with investigators, Isabel provided chilling details about her state of mind leading up to the murders. She spoke of believing that she had promised her family to an evil force, suggesting that her psychotic delusions had convinced her that she was somehow protecting her children by killing them. This type of altruistic delusion, where a parent believes they are saving their children from some terrible fate, is not uncommon in cases of familicide committed by individuals experiencing severe mental illness. She also spoke of taking her children to religious clouds, reinforcing the spiritual dimension of her delusions. In her fractured reality, she may have genuinely believed that she was sending her children to a better place, that she was saving them from some earthly suffering or spiritual corruption. This doesn't make her actions any less horrific, but it provides insight into how completely her mental illness had distorted her perception of reality. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by questions about Isabel's mental state. While there was no doubt about her guilt in terms of having committed the murders, her severe mental illness raised questions about her legal responsibility and her ability to stand trial. Mental health evaluations revealed the extent of her psychotic thinking and her disconnection from reality. In April 2019, Isabel Martinez pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder, 1 count of aggravated assault, and 1 count of cruelty to children. The guilty plea avoided a trial that would have been traumatic for Diana and forced the community to relive the details of that horrible night. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again be in a position to harm another person. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire case is the story of Diana Romero, the 9-year-old girl who survived her mother's attack and lost her entire family in one night. During interviews with child welfare caseworkers, Diana provided crucial details about what had happened, but at an enormous emotional cost to herself. Diana's account revealed the calculated nature of Isabel's actions. She described how her mother moved through the house methodically, how she spoke to Diana about going to see Jesus, how she asked for forgiveness before attacking her own child. These details painted a picture of someone who, despite her mental illness, was aware enough of what she was doing to seek forgiveness for it. The 9-year-old girl found herself in an impossible situation. She was the only witness to the murders of her family, which meant she had to relive the trauma repeatedly during interviews and legal proceedings. She had to describe watching her mother kill her siblings, had to recount the fear and confusion of that night, had to explain what it felt like to be attacked by the person who was supposed to protect her. Beyond the immediate trauma, Diana faced the overwhelming grief of losing her entire family at once. She lost her father, who had been her protector and provider. She lost her siblings, who had been her playmates and companions. And she lost her mother, not just to death but to an act so heinous that it destroyed any sense of safety or trust she might have had. The resilience of children is often remarkable, but the burden placed on Diana was extraordinary. She not only had to heal from her physical wounds but also had to find a way to process grief, betrayal, and trauma that would challenge even the strongest adult. She was placed in the care of relatives, who faced the difficult task of helping her rebuild some sense of normalcy and security. Cases like the Martinez family murders force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, mental illness, and the vulnerability of children. How does a mother, someone whose biological and social role is to protect and nurture her children, become their killer? How do we make sense of an act that seems to violate every natural instinct and social norm? Mental health professionals who study familicide cases have identified several patterns that often appear in these tragedies. Many perpetrators experience severe depression, psychosis, or other mental health crises that distort their thinking. They may develop delusions about protecting their children from some perceived threat, or they may become convinced that death is preferable to the suffering they believe their family will experience. In Isabel's case, her statements about evil forces and spiritual battles suggest that she was experiencing religious or spiritual delusions that convinced her that killing her family was somehow necessary or beneficial. These types of delusions can be particularly powerful because they tap into deeply held beliefs about good and evil, salvation and damnation. It's important to note that mental illness, even severe mental illness, does not typically lead to violence. The vast majority of people with mental health conditions are not dangerous to others. But in rare cases, when mental illness is severe and untreated, when it involves delusions about threats to family members, and when it occurs in the context of other stressors, it can lead to tragic outcomes. The Martinez case also highlights the importance of recognizing warning signs and having systems in place to intervene before tragedies occur. While Isabel's family may have noticed changes in her behavior, they may not have recognized them as signs of dangerous mental illness. Better education about mental health, more accessible mental health services, and stronger community support systems might help prevent similar tragedies. The impact of the Martinez family murders extended far beyond the immediate victims. The first responders who discovered the scene, the investigators who had to document the evidence, the medical personnel who treated Diana, the social workers who interviewed her, all of these professionals were affected by their involvement in this case. Secondary trauma, the emotional distress experienced by those who work with trauma victims, is a real phenomenon that affects many people in helping professions. When the victims are children, when the perpetrator is a family member, when the violence is particularly severe, the psychological impact on those who must deal with the aftermath can be significant. The community of Loganville was also profoundly affected. Parents looked at their own children differently, wondering how they could protect them from dangers that might come from within their own homes. The basic assumption that parents love and protect their children was shaken, replaced by the uncomfortable knowledge that sometimes the greatest threat to a child comes from the person who should be their greatest protector. Neighbors who had known the Martinez family struggled to reconcile the Isabel they thought they knew with the woman who had committed these murders. They searched their memories for signs they might have missed, warning signals they should have recognized. The guilt and confusion experienced by those who knew the family but failed to prevent the tragedy is another form of secondary victimization. The resolution of the Martinez case through Isabel's guilty plea and life sentence provides a form of legal closure, but it doesn't answer all the questions raised by this tragedy. Can there ever be true justice for the murder of 4 innocent children? Can any punishment truly balance the scales when lives so young and full of potential have been ended? Isabel Martinez will spend the rest of her life in prison, removed from society and unable to harm anyone else. But she continues to live while her children do not. She has the opportunity to receive mental health treatment, to potentially find some measure of peace or understanding about what she did, while her victims will never have the chance to grow up, to have families of their own, to fulfill their dreams. For Diana, the question of justice is particularly complex. She lost everything but gained the burden of being the sole survivor, the only witness, the one left to carry the memory of her family. Her healing and her ability to build a meaningful life despite this trauma may be the closest thing to justice that this case can offer. The legal system did what it could by ensuring that Isabel Martinez would never again be in a position to harm a child. But the deeper questions about how such tragedies can be prevented, how families in crisis can be helped before they reach a breaking point, how children can be protected from their own parents, these questions remain largely unanswered. If there are lessons to be learned from the Martinez family murders, they center around the importance of recognizing and addressing mental health crises before they escalate to violence. Isabel's family members noticed changes in her behavior, but they may not have recognized them as signs of dangerous mental illness. Better education about the warning signs of severe mental health problems, more accessible mental health services, and stronger support systems for families in crisis might help prevent similar tragedies. The case also highlights the vulnerability of children within their own families. While we teach children about stranger danger and external threats, we rarely acknowledge that the greatest risk to children often comes from within their own homes. This doesn't mean we should live in fear or suspicion, but it does mean we need better systems for protecting children when their own families become dangerous. For professionals who work with families and children, the Martinez case serves as a reminder of the importance of taking mental health concerns seriously, even when they present in the context of cultural or religious beliefs. Isabel's talk of spiritual battles and evil forces might have seemed like cultural or religious expression rather than symptoms of severe mental illness, but in retrospect, they were warning signs that should have prompted more intensive intervention. For Diana Romero, the survivor of this unthinkable tragedy, the road to healing will be long and difficult. She carries physical scars from her mother's attack, but the emotional and psychological wounds run much deeper. She has lost not only her family but also her sense of safety and trust in the world. Child trauma specialists understand that experiences like Diana's can have lifelong effects. She may struggle with trust issues, with fear and anxiety, with depression and post-traumatic stress. The work of helping her heal will require the dedication of skilled therapists, the love and support of her extended family, and the strength and resilience that children sometimes display in the face of unimaginable adversity. But children are remarkably resilient, and with proper support, Diana has the potential to not just survive but to thrive. She may find ways to honor her family's memory, to create meaning from her survival, to build relationships and experiences that help counterbalance the trauma she has endured. Her healing becomes not just a personal triumph but a form of defiance against the evil that tried to destroy her family completely. Even after the legal proceedings concluded and Isabel Martinez began serving her life sentence, many questions about this case remain unanswered. What specific combination of factors led to her complete psychological break? Could this tragedy have been prevented if she had received different mental health care? How can we better identify and intervene when parents pose a threat to their own children? These questions are not merely academic, they have real implications for preventing future tragedies. Every case of familicide teaches us something about the warning signs, the risk factors, and the points of intervention that might save lives. The Martinez case adds to our understanding of how religious or spiritual delusions can contribute to violence, how grief and loss can trigger mental health crises, and how quickly a family can go from functional to devastated. Researchers who study these cases work to identify patterns that might help predict and prevent future tragedies. They look at the mental health histories of perpetrators, the stressors present in their lives, the warning signs that family members noticed, and the points where intervention might have made a difference. Each case contributes to our understanding of these rare but devastating events. As we seek to understand the mind of Isabel Martinez and the factors that led to her crimes, we must not lose sight of the real victims of this tragedy: Martin Martinez Sr., Dakota, Martin Jr., Axel, and Isabella. These were real people with unique personalities, dreams, and potential that was cut short by violence. Martin Sr. was a father who worked hard to provide for his family, who believed in the possibility of a better life for his children. His death robbed his children not only of their father but of his protection, which might have saved them if he had been aware of the danger in time. Dakota, Martin Jr., Axel, and Isabella were children who deserved to grow up, to experience the joys and challenges of adolescence and adulthood, to make their own mistakes and achievements. They deserve to feel safe in their own home, to trust in their mother's love, to wake up each morning with the confidence that they were protected and cherished. Their deaths represent not just individual tragedies but a collective loss of potential. We will never know what they might have become, what they might have contributed to the world, what families they might have created, what dreams they might have pursued. That loss extends beyond the immediate family to the community and society as a whole. The Martinez family murders occurred within a broader context of domestic violence and family tragedy that affects thousands of families each year. While the systematic murder of multiple family members is rare, violence within families is unfortunately common. Children are far more likely to be harmed by family members than by strangers, and domestic violence affects families across all social, economic, and cultural lines. This case also occurred within the context of discussions about mental health, immigration, and social support systems. Isabel Martinez was an immigrant who may have faced additional stressors related to language barriers, cultural differences, and social isolation. She was dealing with grief over her father's death, the stress of raising 5 children, and what appears to have been a severe mental health crisis. The combination of these factors created a perfect storm that ended in tragedy. Understanding cases like this requires us to look beyond the individual perpetrator to the larger systems and structures that might have provided support, intervention, or prevention. It requires us to consider how mental health services are accessed and delivered, how communities support families in crisis, and how we can better protect vulnerable children. The Martinez family murders will be remembered as one of the most shocking crimes in Gwinnett County's history, but they should also be remembered as a call to action. Diana Romero's survival and her courage in helping investigators understand what happened that night ensured that the truth came to light and that justice was served. Her ongoing healing journey serves as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of supporting survivors of trauma. The loss of her family is irreplaceable, but her survival gives meaning to their deaths and hope for the future. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of mental health awareness and intervention. While we cannot predict or prevent every tragedy, we can work to create systems that better identify and support families in crisis. We can educate ourselves about the warning signs of severe mental illness and the resources available to help. The story of Isabel Martinez and the murder of her family is one that challenges our most basic assumptions about human nature, parental love, and family safety. It forces us to confront the reality that sometimes the greatest threats come from within our own homes, that mental illness can transform a protector into a predator, and that children can be vulnerable to the very people who should keep them safe. But it is also a story about survival, resilience, and the importance of seeking truth and justice even in the face of unthinkable tragedy. Diana Romero's courage in surviving and in helping authorities understand what happened ensured that her family's story would be told and that her mother would be held accountable for her crimes. As we reflect on this case, we are reminded of the preciousness of life, the vulnerability of children, and the importance of supporting families and individuals who are struggling with mental health crises. We are also reminded that even in the darkest moments, there can be hope, hope for healing, hope for justice, and hope that by understanding these tragedies, we might prevent others from experiencing similar loss. The Martinez family murders will remain a dark chapter in the history of Loganville, Georgia, but they also serve as a testament to the importance of vigilance, compassion, and support for those who are struggling. In remembering the victims and supporting the survivor, we honor their lives and work toward a future where such tragedies might be prevented. The quiet streets of Loganville have returned to their normal rhythms, children once again play in yards and ride their bikes to school. But the memory of what happened in one house on one terrible night serves as a reminder that safety is never guaranteed, that families can shatter without warning, and that the work of protecting children and supporting struggling families is never finished. In the end, the Martinez case stands as both a tragedy and a warning, a story of loss so profound that it defies comprehension but also a call to action for all of us who believe that children deserve to be safe, that families in crisis deserve support, and that even the darkest nights can eventually give way to dawn. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we journey to the quiet suburbs of Lorain County, Ohio, where a tragic tale of domestic violence and murder unfolded in the summer of 2011. This is the story of Holly Demby, a devoted mother and educator whose life was cut short by the very person who had vowed to protect her. In the rolling hills of Grafton Township, Ohio, where cornfields stretched toward distant horizons and suburban homes dotted tree-lined streets, Holly Demby had built what appeared to be an idyllic life. At 33 years old, she embodied the American dream of a working mother balancing career aspirations with family devotion. Holly worked as a special education teaching aide within the Midview School District, a position that reflected her genuine belief in the transformative power of education. Day after day, she poured her heart into helping children with special needs, offering patience and understanding that seemed to flow naturally from her gentle spirit. Her colleagues knew her as someone who never lost faith in a child's potential, no matter how challenging their circumstances might be. Beyond her professional life, Holly was pursuing her bachelor's degree at Lorain County Community College, often studying late into the evening after her young son had been tucked into bed. Her textbooks and notebooks were scattered throughout their home on Cowley Road, evidence of a woman determined to better herself and provide more opportunities for her family. The house itself was striking, a large white structure with distinctive green shutters that stood out among the neighboring homes. It sat on a generous lot where Holly could often be seen tending to the yard work, her laughter occasionally drifting across to neighbors who had grown accustomed to the sound of her voice floating through their windows during warm summer evenings. Neighbors would later recall how Holly seemed to be the visible presence in the household. They'd see her mowing the lawn, working in the garden, or simply enjoying the outdoors. Her husband, William Demby, was a more shadowy figure, occasionally glimpsed but rarely heard. The contrast between the couple was stark to those who paid attention to such things. William worked as a corrections officer at the Lorain County Jail, a job that required him to maintain order among some of society's most troubled individuals. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the authority that his profession demanded, but those who knew him well sensed something simmering beneath the surface, a tension that seemed to grow stronger as the months passed. The couple had been married for roughly 6 years, and their young son was the center of Holly's universe. She spoke often of her dreams for his future, the education she hoped to provide him, and the stable home she was working so hard to maintain. On the surface, they appeared to be just another suburban family navigating the typical challenges of work, parenting, and making ends meet. As summer turned toward its peak in 2011, the carefully constructed facade of the Demby household began to show stress fractures that would prove impossible to repair. Beneath the manicured exterior of their Grafton Township home, a dangerous dynamic was taking shape that would ultimately lead to tragedy. Those closest to the couple began noticing subtle changes in their interactions. Holly, typically vibrant and outgoing in her professional life, seemed increasingly withdrawn when it came to discussing her home life. Colleagues at the school district noticed she appeared tired more often, though she maintained her dedication to her students with unwavering commitment. William's behavior had also become more erratic according to later court testimony. The stress of his job at the county jail, combined with personal pressures, seemed to be wearing on him in ways that were becoming harder to hide. He complained of feeling underappreciated and misunderstood, emotions that would later play a central role in the defense strategy his attorneys would employ. The couple's financial situation added another layer of stress to their relationship. Like many families during the economic uncertainty of the early 2010s, they were juggling multiple responsibilities while trying to maintain their standard of living. Holly's pursuit of her college degree represented both an investment in their future and an additional expense that strained their budget. Meanwhile, their son remained blissfully unaware of the growing tension between his parents. He attended school, played with neighborhood children, and lived the carefree existence that every child deserves. Holly worked tirelessly to ensure that her marital problems never spilled over into her child's world, a testament to her protective instincts as a mother. The house on Cowley Road, which had once felt like a sanctuary, was gradually becoming a pressure cooker. Neighbors who had grown accustomed to hearing Holly's voice and laughter through their windows began to notice longer periods of silence. The yard work that she had always maintained with such care became more sporadic, though she still tried to keep up appearances. In the weeks leading up to that fateful August night, there were signs that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Court documents would later reveal claims of infidelity and emotional abuse, accusations that painted a picture of a marriage in its death throes. Whether these claims were accurate or simply the desperate attempts of a man trying to justify the unjustifiable would become a matter of intense legal debate. What is certain is that by August 11, 2011, the tensions that had been building for months were about to reach a breaking point that would destroy not just one life, but the entire fabric of a family that had once held such promise. August 11, 2011, began like any other summer evening in Grafton Township. The sun set slowly over the corn fields, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of the quiet suburban homes. Children were called in from their evening play, and the familiar rhythms of dinner preparation and homework supervision filled households throughout the neighborhood. At the Demby residence on Cowley Road, however, the evening would take a turn that no one could have anticipated. The precise sequence of events that led to the tragedy remains a subject of legal and emotional debate, but the horrific outcome was undeniable. According to the timeline established by investigators, the confrontation between Holly and William Demby began sometime after their son had been settled for the night. Court testimony would later reveal that their young boy was not present in the home when the violence erupted, a small mercy in an otherwise unthinkable situation. The argument, whatever its specific catalyst, escalated with shocking speed and brutality. Holly, perhaps sensing the dangerous mood her husband was in, attempted to escape from the second-floor bathroom by climbing out through the window. The desperation of this act speaks to the terror she must have felt in those final moments, a 33-year-old woman so afraid for her life that she was willing to risk a dangerous fall rather than face whatever threat awaited her inside the house. But her escape attempt was unsuccessful. William, armed with a knife from their kitchen, pursued his wife with a determination that suggested this was not a spontaneous act of passion but rather the culmination of long-simmering rage and resentment. The attack, when it came, was swift and savage. Holly suffered multiple stab wounds in what investigators would later describe as an assault of shocking brutality. The violence was so severe that William himself would later tell 911 dispatchers that he had beheaded his wife, though this claim would prove to be an exaggeration born from either the adrenaline of the moment or a desire to shock. After the attack, Holly's body was found in the backyard of their home, behind the house where she had worked so hard to build a life for her family. The scene that greeted responding officers was one that would haunt them for years to come, evidence of a domestic dispute that had escalated far beyond anything that could be justified or explained away. At 1:32 in the morning on August 12, 2011, William Demby placed a call to the Lorain County Sheriff's Office using a direct line that bypassed the normal 911 system. His voice, captured on recordings that would later be played in court, was eerily calm as he confessed to killing his wife. The casual tone with which he described the horrific act sent chills through everyone who heard it. When deputies arrived at the large white house with green shutters, they found William waiting for them in the driveway. He approached the officers without resistance and calmly repeated his confession, stating that he had killed his wife and was prepared to face the consequences of his actions. The contrast between his matter-of-fact demeanor and the horrific scene they discovered in the backyard was jarring. Here was a man who had just committed an act of unspeakable violence, yet he appeared almost relieved that it was finally over. The Lorain County Sheriff's Office responded to William Demby's confession with the professionalism and thoroughness that such a grave situation demanded. Deputies secured the scene while detectives began the painstaking process of documenting every detail of what had transpired at the Cowley Road residence. The investigation revealed a crime scene that told a story of desperation and violence. The second-floor bathroom window through which Holly had attempted to escape bore evidence of her frantic efforts to flee. The path of the attack could be traced through the house and into the backyard, where her life had ultimately ended. Forensic specialists worked through the night and into the following day, photographing evidence, collecting samples, and piecing together the timeline of events. The knife used in the attack was recovered, and the multiple stab wounds that Holly had suffered were carefully documented by the county coroner. What emerged from the investigation was a picture of domestic violence that had escalated to its ultimate conclusion. While William's confession eliminated any mystery about who was responsible for Holly's death, the legal system still required a thorough investigation to determine the appropriate charges and to ensure that justice would be served. The 911 recording of William's confession became a crucial piece of evidence, not just for what it revealed about his actions but for the tone and manner in which he described them. Legal experts would later analyze every word and inflection, searching for clues about his mental state and the premeditated nature of his actions. As news of the murder spread through the community, neighbors and colleagues struggled to comprehend what had happened. The Holly Demby they knew, the dedicated teacher's aide, the loving mother, the woman who could be heard laughing in her yard on summer evenings, was gone, her life ended by someone who had promised to love and protect her. The investigation also revealed the complex dynamics that had been at play in the Demby household. Court documents filed in the wake of Williams' arrest included claims and counterclaims about the nature of their relationship, with defense attorneys later arguing that Holly had been involved in an extramarital affair and had subjected William to years of emotional abuse. These claims, whether true or fabricated, highlighted the challenges that investigators face when domestic violence cases escalate to murder. The victim is no longer able to tell her side of the story, leaving the legal system to sift through competing narratives and conflicting accounts of what life was really like behind closed doors. What was indisputable was that a young child had lost his mother and would grow up knowing that his father was responsible for her death. This tragic reality added another layer of complexity to a case that was already emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The wheels of justice began turning quickly in the aftermath of Holly Demby's murder. William Demby was arrested and charged with a range of offenses including aggravated murder, felonious assault, and domestic violence. The decision to pursue multiple charges reflected the prosecutor's determination to ensure that justice would be served regardless of how a jury might interpret the evidence. The preliminary hearing, held in Elyria Municipal Court, provided the first public glimpse into the horrific details of Holly's final moments. Testimony revealed her desperate attempt to escape through the bathroom window and the brutal nature of the attack that followed. The courtroom was filled with family members, friends, and community members who struggled to comprehend the violence that had shattered their quiet suburban neighborhood. Williams' defense team, faced with an overwhelming burden of evidence including their client's recorded confession, chose to pursue a strategy that would prove controversial and emotionally devastating for Holly's family. They argued that the murder had been committed in a fit of passion rather than as a premeditated act, hoping to reduce the charges from aggravated murder to a lesser offense. Central to this defense strategy were claims that Holly had been having an affair with a married man and had subjected William to years of emotional and psychological abuse. The defense painted a picture of a man who had finally snapped under the pressure of his wife's alleged infidelity and abuse, arguing that his actions, while inexcusable, were the result of extreme emotional disturbance rather than calculated malice. These arguments required Holly's family and friends to sit through hours of testimony that attacked her character and portrayed her as the architect of her own demise. For those who had known and loved Holly, the defense strategy felt like a second assault on a woman who could no longer defend herself. The prosecution, led by experienced attorneys from the Lorain County Prosecutor's Office, methodically dismantled the defense's arguments while presenting evidence of the brutal nature of the attack. They argued that the severity of Holly's injuries and the circumstances surrounding the murder indicated a level of planning and deliberation that went far beyond a momentary loss of control. Expert witnesses testified about the pattern of domestic violence, explaining how abuse often escalates over time and how claims of provocation are frequently used to justify inexcusable acts of violence. The prosecution's case was strengthened by Williams' own recorded confession, which they argued demonstrated a consciousness of guilt and an understanding of the gravity of his actions. Throughout the proceedings, Holly's family maintained their dignity while advocating for justice for their beloved daughter, sister, and mother. They established a memorial fund to help support Holly's young son, ensuring that her legacy would include not just the tragedy of her death but also the love and support that surrounded him in its aftermath. The media coverage of the case brought unwanted attention to a community that prided itself on its quiet, family-friendly atmosphere. Reporters descended on Grafton Township, interviewing neighbors and painting pictures of the perfect suburban home where such unthinkable violence had occurred. When the case finally went to trial, the prosecution and defense presented starkly different narratives about what had led to Holly Demby's death. The proceedings, conducted as a bench trial rather than a jury trial, placed the ultimate decision about William's fate in the hands of a single judge who would have to weigh the evidence and determine the appropriate level of justice. The judge, faced with William's recorded confession and the overwhelming physical evidence, rejected the defense's claims of extreme emotional disturbance while acknowledging that the evidence did not support a conviction for premeditated aggravated murder. In a carefully reasoned decision, the court found William guilty of 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of felonious assault, and 1 count of domestic violence. The conviction on multiple counts reflected the judge's understanding that William's actions that night constituted separate offenses that deserved individual recognition under the law. The 2 murder counts addressed both the intentional killing of Holly and the killing that occurred during the commission of domestic violence, while the felonious assault charges recognized the brutal nature of the attack itself. At the sentencing hearing, William's fate was sealed when the judge imposed a sentence of 20 years to life in prison. The sentence reflected both the gravity of the crime and the impact it had on Holly's family and the broader community. With the possibility of parole after 20 years, William would spend the majority of his remaining life behind bars, though the possibility of eventual release meant that Holly's family would face the ongoing uncertainty of potential parole hearings in the years to come. The sentencing brought a measure of closure to a legal process that had dragged on for more than 2 years, but it could never truly heal the wounds that had been inflicted on Holly's loved ones. Her son, who had been shielded from much of the legal proceedings, would grow up knowing that his mother had been taken from him by his own father. In the aftermath of the conviction, Holly's family pursued a wrongful death lawsuit against William, seeking financial compensation that could be used to support their grandson's future. The lawsuit was eventually settled for $200,000, a sum that, while significant, could never compensate for the loss of a beloved family member. The case also prompted renewed discussions about domestic violence prevention and the warning signs that might have been overlooked in the Demby household. Advocates used Holly's story as an example of how domestic violence can escalate without warning and how important it is for communities to recognize and respond to signs of abuse before they reach a tragic conclusion. William's conviction was later upheld on appeal, with the 9th District Court of Appeals rejecting his arguments that his convictions should be overturned or reduced. The appellate court's decision provided finality to a case that had already consumed years of legal proceedings and emotional turmoil for everyone involved. The murder of Holly Demby sent shockwaves through the Grafton Township community that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the crime. Neighbors who had lived peacefully for years found themselves questioning their assumptions about the safety and security of their suburban enclave. The house on Cowley Road, once a symbol of domestic stability and middle-class achievement, became a constant reminder of the violence that had occurred within its walls. The large white structure with green shutters stood empty for extended periods as Holly's family struggled with the practical and emotional challenges of dealing with a property where such tragedy had occurred. Holly's mother, Cheryl Folds, and other family members faced the heartbreaking task of cleaning out the home and disposing of belongings that held memories of happier times. On one occasion, deputies had to return to the property when family members were found burning items that had belonged to William, a symbolic act that reflected their desperate need to purge any reminders of the man who had destroyed their family. The impact on Holly's colleagues at the Midview School District was profound and lasting. Students who had benefited from her patient guidance suddenly found themselves without their beloved teacher's aid, and faculty members struggled to explain her absence to children who had grown attached to her gentle presence. The special education students whom Holly had served with such dedication were particularly affected by her sudden disappearance from their lives. These vulnerable children, who often struggled with change and transitions, had to cope with the loss of someone who had provided stability and support during their most challenging academic moments. Holly's pursuit of her bachelor's degree, which had represented hope for a brighter future, was left unfinished. Her textbooks and notebooks, discovered throughout the house during the investigation, served as poignant reminders of dreams that would never be fulfilled and goals that would never be achieved. The broader community of Lorain County also grappled with the implications of having a corrections officer commit such a heinous crime. William's employment at the county jail raised uncomfortable questions about the psychological screening and ongoing mental health support provided to law enforcement personnel who deal with society's most troubled individuals on a daily basis. Local domestic violence organizations used Holly's case as an opportunity to educate the public about the warning signs of abuse and the resources available to women who find themselves in dangerous relationships. Her story became part of training materials and awareness campaigns designed to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The establishment of a memorial fund for Holly's son ensured that her legacy would include not just the circumstances of her death but also the community's commitment to supporting the innocent victim of domestic violence. The fund represented a collective effort to provide some measure of security and opportunity for a child whose life had been forever altered by his father's actions. As we reflect on the tragic story of Holly Demby, we are reminded of the hidden complexities that can exist behind the facade of suburban normalcy. Her case illustrates how domestic violence can escalate with shocking speed, transforming what appears to be a stable household into a scene of unthinkable brutality. The warning signs that preceded Holly's murder were subtle enough that neighbors and colleagues failed to recognize them as indicators of mortal danger. Her desperate attempt to escape through a second-floor bathroom window suggests that she may have sensed the threat to her life, but by then it was already too late to seek the help that might have saved her. The role of law enforcement in domestic violence cases is highlighted by the fact that William worked as a corrections officer. His familiarity with the criminal justice system may have given him insights into how to avoid detection or how to manipulate the legal process to his advantage. It also raises questions about whether his professional exposure to violence and criminal behavior contributed to his own descent into brutality. The defense strategy employed in Williams' trial reflects a common pattern in domestic violence cases where the victim is portrayed as somehow responsible for provoking the attack that killed her. This victim-blaming approach not only adds to the trauma experienced by surviving family members but also perpetuates dangerous myths about domestic violence that can prevent other victims from seeking help. Holly's story also demonstrates the far-reaching impact of domestic violence on children who survive such tragedies. Her son will carry the burden of his mother's murder and his father's actions for the rest of his life, a psychological wound that may never fully heal despite the love and support of extended family members. The community response to Holly's murder, including the establishment of a memorial fund and increased awareness of domestic violence resources, shows how tragedy can sometimes catalyze positive change. While nothing can bring Holly back or undo the trauma inflicted on her family, her story has potentially saved other lives by increasing awareness of the warning signs and resources available to potential victims. The legal proceedings that followed Holly's murder illustrate both the strengths and limitations of the criminal justice system in addressing domestic violence. While William was ultimately convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, the legal process was prolonged and emotionally devastating for Holly's family, who had to endure months of character assassination and victim blaming. The civil lawsuit that resulted in a $200,000 settlement provides some financial security for Holly's son but cannot compensate for the loss of a mother's love and guidance. It serves as a reminder that while the legal system can provide a measure of justice and accountability, it cannot restore what has been lost or heal the deepest wounds inflicted by domestic violence. As we conclude this difficult but important story, it's essential that we remember Holly Demby not just as a victim of domestic violence but as a complete human being who lived a life filled with purpose, love, and hope. She was a dedicated educator who believed in the potential of every child she served, a loving mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her son's future, and a woman pursuing her own dreams of higher education and personal growth. The quiet neighborhood of Grafton Township has slowly healed from the trauma of that August night in 2011, but Holly's memory continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of recognizing and addressing domestic violence before it escalates to tragedy. Her story has become part of the broader conversation about protecting vulnerable individuals and supporting survivors of abuse. Her son, now growing up without his mother, carries forward her legacy of kindness and determination. The memorial fund established in Holly's honor helps ensure that he will have opportunities for education and growth that his mother valued so deeply. In this way, Holly's belief in the power of education continues to influence lives even after her death. The special education students whom Holly served have moved on to other classrooms and other teachers, but those who knew her remember the patience and compassion she brought to her work. Her approach to helping children with special needs serves as a model for educators who understand that their role extends far beyond academic instruction to include emotional support and personal encouragement. William Demby remains incarcerated, serving his sentence of 20 years to life. His earliest possible parole date looms in the future, a reminder that the consequences of domestic violence extend far beyond the immediate tragedy to affect survivors, families, and communities for decades to come. Holly's story reminds us that domestic violence can affect anyone, regardless of their education, profession, or social standing. It challenges us to look beyond surface appearances and to recognize that the quiet neighborhoods and seemingly stable households around us may harbor secrets and dangers that remain hidden until it's too late. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll spare a thought for Holly Demby and the countless other victims of domestic violence whose stories may never be told. Their memories serve as both a warning and a call to action, reminding us of our collective responsibility to create a world where such tragedies are prevented rather than simply punished after the fact. In the darkness of night, when our thoughts turn inward and our defenses are lowered, we can honor Holly's memory by committing ourselves to greater awareness, deeper compassion, and stronger action in the face of domestic violence. Her story, tragic as it is, carries within it the seeds of hope for a future where other mothers, daughters, and sisters might be spared a similar fate. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.